I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor.
Very, very rocky.
Death by government.
Drain the swamp.
Hello and welcome to another installment of Liberty Nation's Swamponomics videocast. I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor. This week, tax cuts and budget deficits. The US government recently achieved a milestone before the country flipped the calendar to 2024. The national debt topped $34 trillion. Last year, Washington accomplished three milestones: $32 trillion, $33 trillion, and then $34 trillion. In total, Washington added approximately $2.65 trillion to the national debt in a single year. To put this into context, it took the United States more than 200 years to accumulate $1 trillion in national debt, and now takes the federal government a couple of months. Before you know it, $1 trillion will eventually become a rounding error. At a recent White House briefing, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre was asked about President Joe Biden's thoughts on this impressive feat. Her response? Blame Republicans. Here's what she told the brave men and women in the White House press room.
And do you have any reaction to the new data out of Treasury that the national debt has hit a record $34 trillion?
So if you look at that data, it's a trickle. There's a trickle down debt. If you think about it, Republican tax cuts are responsible for about 90% of it. Of the increase in the debt as a share of the economy over the last 2 decades, excluding emergency spending. And so, as we know, you've heard me say this, you've heard the president speak to this, of what he has done to certainly lower the debt. He signed a legislation to lower the deficit by $1 trillion. What we've seen on the other side is the complete opposite. What they've tried to do is continue to give a tax break to the millionaires and the billionaires. And that, what they have actually put forward, would add more than $3 trillion to the debt. So that's what that data shows us, and that's what we have done to try to make sure. And the president has been very, very deliberate about this, to make sure that we do everything we can to certainly deal with the debt.
Did you catch that? According to Jean-Pierre, the GOP's tax cuts of the last 20 years have resulted in 90% of the national debt increase. Has she even taken a look at the numbers? Unlikely, and neither has any of the Democrats who pair similar talking points. Remember, Congressman Ro Khanna recently commented on X that the Reagan, Bush, and Trump tax cuts led to ballooning debt levels. The only thing he was right about was that foreign wars added to the national debt. But these are laughable claims because the revenue data is easily accessible. Let's go all the way back to the Reagan tax cuts. There were 2 rounds of them. One in 1981 and the other in 1986. The first round of tax reductions resulted in a 15% increase in federal revenues. After the second round, there was a 39% boost to the government's pockets. When former President George W. Bush signed 2 laws that resulted in tax cuts in 2001 and 2003, federal tax receipts skyrocketed 61%. They then, of course, crashed when the global financial crisis happened. What made Bushonomics reckless was the other public policy pursuits emanating from his administration, putting 2 major wars on credit cards, Medicare Part D, banker bailouts, and his famous proclamation that, quote, "I have abandoned free market principles to save the free market system." Don't remember that? Here's the old clip from 2008.
I've abandoned free market principles to save the free market system.
Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump's tax cuts allowed Washington to bolster its coffers by 9%, which could have been more if not for the coronavirus pandemic, which led to astronomical levels of spending. This is part of the idea that tax cuts typically lead to higher revenues, also known as the Laffer curve. Under this theory, reducing the tax rate will stimulate the economy by boosting incentives to work and invest, and as a result, bolster government revenues. Or, as legendary economist Milton Friedman famously said, quote, "I am in favor of cutting taxes under any circumstances and for any excuse for any reason whenever it's possible." The White House disagrees, writing in October 2023 that Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act led to lower revenues. The data, as illustrated, suggests otherwise. Of course, let's say that the current administration is being forthright in its argument. Let's contend that the Trump tax cuts reduce revenues for the government. Do Biden officials not see something wrong with federal spending reaching $7 trillion? The White House projections show $2 trillion deficits being the new normal in a few years, running $17 trillion worth of cumulative deficits by the year 2033. Now, they could reverse these tax cuts. They could, let's say, impose a billionaire's tax, and it would still not be enough to plug the gaping hole in Washington. And here's a deal that some Republicans do not want to admit. Tax cuts are terrific, but they should be complemented by spending cuts even if they pad tax receipts. Instead, since the Reagan tax cuts, federal spending exploded nearly 900%. Lo and behold, after crossing the $1 trillion event horizon in October 1981, the national debt exceeded $34 trillion 43 years later. You cannot keep cutting taxes without reining in spending. Meanwhile, another factor that should be considered is the Ricardian effect. This is an economic theory that says increasing government deficits will not stimulate demand as intended. Plus, remember, the federal government is running $1 or $2 trillion budget gaps without a declared recession, though we tend to ignore the technical recession that occurred in the first half of 2022. So what happens if there is a steep economic downturn, a financial crisis, or an economic collapse, and the government is forced to then impose emergency spending, stimulus, and relief efforts? These perpetual deficits will only exacerbate America's fiscal crisis, and tax hikes will not be enough. That's it for me this week. Please read my full Swamponomics column on the pages of LibertyNation.com, and be sure to check out my previous Swamponomics TV videos and interviews. There are more than 100 of them. Thank you. I'm Andrew Moran, Liberty Nation's economics editor.
Very, very rocky.
Death by government.
Great